Hi, this is Ed in San Diego, and you're back on Global TV Talk Show. My very special guest today is live right now in the Munich, Germany area. And welcome, Martijn Feldbrugge.
Thank you very much, Ed.
So,
Nice to meet you.
did I say that wrong?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. We're going to talk today about a really technical, serious problem, especially with the headlines, with Russia's Putin wanting countries to not do business with Ukraine's grain. So that's a sanction, isn't it? Or is it just a war threat?
Well, if you ask me, what Putin is doing is basically putting sanctions on people buying Ukrainian grain. So yes, you're right. It's sanctions all over again, but not from a US or EU perspective, but from a Russian perspective.
Whew. So I'm up to here with that guy, but we've got to deal with him somehow. So let's talk about sanctions and export controls, because the U.S. is doing it against Russia. They're doing it against a lot of countries, but Iran, or Iran, as they say it. Tell me about sanctions are rules, warnings, taxes, legal regulations. I'm a layman, and you're the tech expert here. So I'm going to ask you, what are sanctions and export controls? What kind of sanctions are there, and how do they work? How does a country manage all of that? And a company, especially a manufacturer and a shipper, has to comply or else.
Yes, that's fully correct. So first to sanctions. What's sanctions? Well, basically sanctions are rules, laws and regulations to make people change behavior. If I don't like what you're doing, like Putin with Ukraine, you can basically do two things. You can just grab your weapons as Putin did and go to the country and fight them, or be maybe a bit more sophisticated and do it in an economic way. And that kind of warfare, I call it warfare too. Economic warfare is basically putting people under sanctions. So tell them that certain rules apply and that others may not conduct business with them. That's basically sanctions. It's against countries, it's against people, drug traffickers, people that spread weapons of mass destruction, companies that support that behavior, countries, like I said, like Iran, as we know, North Korea, Russia, and so on. Cuba in the past with the Pixpay incident, it's still under sanctions. So sanctions basically are rules and regulations to make the people that do bad things, in our opinion, change their behavior. And yes, you will see that those people might put sanctions on you to change your behavior. So it's basically economic warfare. To who does this all apply? Well, like I said, people, companies, sometimes complete countries or parts of countries. Who issues them? Like you said, the United States, but there's also the United Nations. When someone doesn't give a veto, there is the EU with a lot of members. There's Japan, there's Canada, Australia. Basically, any country can issue sanctions against one or more other countries.
So we just saw that with the Turkey leader, Erdogan, and at NATO, it's all politics, I'm sure. At first he was yelling and screaming that, and probably for good reason, because of the Quran burning, but which was stupid, of course. But then he was trying to block out a country from joining NATO. All right. And then all of a sudden he did a switch. Now, something happened there, which maybe there'll be a book about it someday, but it's a mystery. But somebody made a deal that he couldn't refuse. And then all of a sudden he changed his tune. So sanctions can be taken off just as fast as they can be put on. Isn't that correct?
Theoretically, yes. If you put sanctions, the way that Erdogan did it is more political statements. It's not really sanctions. It's not putting a law into place that prevents something from happening. It's just not supporting a certain request. But sanctions themselves can be issued. We've seen a German bank that conducted a lot of business with Iran, and the US said, we don't want you to do that, and they put them on the sanctions list, the bank and its CEO. And they stayed on the list for, I think, for 9 months. And the bank went bankrupt. They didn't do any business with the US, only with Iran. The bank went bankrupt, and then they were just taken off the list again, and everything was over. So yes, it can go rather fast.
So companies need help because there's too much going on here, and this is where you step in.
Yes, exactly. The thing is, if you would want to know all these rules from all these countries, and I only know the rules, for example, of the Netherlands, Germany, Switzerland, EU, UN, UK, the US, and that's already a lot of, but there's more countries in the world. I can't know all those rules, and still I think I'm a sanction specialist, or I pretend to be one. And the way to do it is not to know all the rules, but to know how you can find whether such a rule may apply. And that's what companies should be doing. They should be looking at their business partners, not just their customers, but business partners in general. And are they on some kind of sanctions list? And the second thing you should do if you have a transaction is look whether that transaction might be subject to sanction. And to find that, it's rather simple. There's 4 steps you should take. First one is screen against sanctions list. So look if someone that is mentioned on a sanctions list that is relevant for you is in your transaction, or is your customer or your business relation. Second step is look at what countries are involved. We mentioned Russia, North Korea, we might mention China, Cuba. Those are sanctioned countries. When you have such a country in your transaction or as a customer, you know there might be trouble, so you should do more. You should start looking at rules. Third is the goods. If it's military goods, if it's chemicals to make drugs, all these kinds of stuff, you probably have to do more as just sell your product. And the last step with sanctions is look at whether the transaction makes sense. Is it not money laundering? Is it not tax evasion? Is it not a way to finance terrorism? And if you do these 4 steps as a business, you know whether a risk applies. And if you say, well, I see that there's a person listed on a sanctions list, you can do 2 things, is start reading all the rules or call me.
So sanctions consultancy, right?
Exactly.
So the information is available publicly online,
Yes.
right? But who internally would have the time to do that? Would that be a general counsel, or would it be the CEO?
I don't think a CEO would have time for that. What we generally see with larger companies is that they have something that's called compliance, a compliance department, which basically should transfer the external and internal rules into procedures, processes that the business can execute. So someone that is doing compliance could be the central point that if someone in the business says, okay, we do these 4 steps and we found a hit on a sanctions list, they should probably escalate to this compliance person within the company and say, help. And this compliance person may either have the experience to know what he or she should be doing, or they should contact someone with knowledge. And I said they should call me. Well, I'm not the only one in the world. There's a lot of lawyers. There's a lot of consultants on sanctions as well. There's an association that has people working on compliance. So you can just contact one of those and they should know what's happening.
So I have an interview coming up with on tomorrow, Friday, with a gentleman who's in Singapore, and he's with a large, very large, well-known, publicly traded tech company, which I won't name, not need to. And he's just stepping into a role for that company that apparently is a new role for the company. It's a new position for him, and it's all about compliance. So he he came to that as a result of being an expert in global talent mobility and immigration and tax from cross-border employment. And so it's full of compliance stuff there, but it's different from what you're saying. The compliance now is, as we're talking about sanctions and how confusing they are and how technical. And so he's being put into that role now, starting, I think, August 1, and he's just getting his feet wet. So we're going to be talking about that transition in that interview. So this meeting was appealed to me because I don't know nothing about sanctions other than what I read in the headlines, and that takes around 30 seconds because then it goes bang right over my head.
Yeah. I've been working, for your information, on sanctions since 2005. So yes, I've read all the laws and regulations, not once, but many times. Any changing in the rules and regulations, I read them. You have to keep up to date. And if he starts into the role and has not done anything of that, he should make sure that he has people around him that can support him on specific issues. That's what I do. If I have a drilling platform that's being built in Singapore by Malaysian people, and the owner of the platform is in Australia, and the platform is going to be placed into Iran, oil territory, how does it look with sanctions? What can you do? What can't you do? Are there conflicting sanctions? Yes, there are. Is the US the same as the EU? No, there isn't. There's conflicting there. Because the EU allows you to do business with Iran, the US does not, and the EU forbids you to follow US rules. And how do you solve that if you're in Australia? And this kind of complexity, I know people then, I call a lawyer in Australia, say, how do your rules look? And I tell them about the rules I know, and we match up that whether we have conflicts or similarities. It is a complex world.
I think almost on purpose to create opportunity as well as the need for expertise.
I don't think that's the case, because what we see happen more and more, luckily enough, and I'm fully supporting that, is alignment between countries. If we look at the sanctions against Russia, we see that the EU, the US, the UK, Canada, Japan, Australia, Switzerland, and I forgot a few, are all aligning their sanctions. And they really are working on the same thing. There is an advice on sanctions from the US, which has been published in name of the US and the UK at the same time. So they have the same advice.
This is really interesting, Martijn. Thank you very much for being my guest. As we come to a close in the next few minutes, I want to make sure that my audience can find out more about you. Would you like to just recite what your website is?
My website is www.bscn.nl, and I'll, how do you say it by letter, which is Bravo, Sierra, Charlie, November, November, Lima.
That's great. I've never heard that done before. So I'm reading your bio here. You graduated cum laude in business administration after a life in IT and project management. You then specialized in the compliance field of sanctions and export controls. You are a sanctions consultant, a troubleshooter in heart and soul, a project leader, program manager, and process supervisor with solid ICT, financial and business background, and a lot of empathy for the organization of his clients. What's ICT?
Information and communication technology. So basically, it used to be ICT used to be IT plus communication, so telephony.
Thank you. I've learned so much from this 15 minutes of dialogue from you.
So.
And I think the audience.
One thing I should mention, Ed, is that when people do not comply, and that's what we mentioned at the start, the US does have big fines. It's not just the US, but the US does have big fines. A basic fine is, I think, $360,000.
Oh my God!
Twice the value of the transaction, yeah. Whatever is more. So people should comply, and if they are doubting it, please talk about it. and then we can always see where the help is needed. And talking is free to start with.
And I'd be glad to make an introduction to my friend in Singapore. And, who knows, maybe you guys can connect. And I thank you for being my guest on Global TV, Mark. Nice to meet you.
Thank you very much, Ed.
Thank you. Have a good day. Have a good evening.
Bye-bye.
Ciao.